Hey, Sens fans, this week on the Senstennial Podcast, we're excited to have on Micah McCurdy at Ineffective Math on Twitter joining us. And for those who are unfamiliar with Micah's work, Micah is a mathematician who creates data visualizations with a focus on NHL analytics. So we're pretty excited to have him on the show today. And Micah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So, of course, with Ottawa, they have missed the playoffs for 5 straight years, but they have a very young and upcoming core, and they have a lot of promise. So, with players like Brady Tkachuk, Josh Norris, Tim Stützle, and Drake Batherson leading the group up front, and then Thomas Chabot leading the group from the blue line, when assessing your data, did any of those players stick out to you as having really underrated years this year?
So Brady Tkachuk sticks out in every data set. I don't know about underrated, but he's the kind of person where it's difficult to miss him, and that's true both when you're watching him play, just because of his style, and also because of what you see in terms of his results when you look at measurement of what he's doing on the ice and what the Senators are doing when he's on the ice. He has an extremely unusual style. There's plenty of guys where you say that, you should probably shoot the puck a little bit more. And Tkachuk is probably the rare exception to that, where you think he should maybe shoot the puck a little bit less. He's an incredible generator of offense. And a lot of that is by personally shooting the puck in ways that generate a lot of rebounds. And so there's a lot of volume that goes on. So he really stands out of all of those. They all have their various different strengths and weaknesses, but Brady's by far the most obvious of that set.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, he kind of just does everything out there. Even this season, I don't think many people were expecting him to get 30 goals and then be the guy who hits as much as he does and gets in fights and I don't know, he's just kind of everywhere. And I think this year, in my opinion anyway, I thought he took a step forward with his playmaking. He seemed to have better passing and looking for better lanes to pass the puck into than he had last year. And he's not falling down as much. I know he kind of had that Bambi skating style going on for at least a couple of years. So I think he's made definite strides to his game. I think
definitely more vision. And I don't think you'd really call him a playmaker still. He's definitely still shoot first.
Right.
But it was, the stereotype about him that, like I was describing a second ago, was more true the year before last than it is now. And so I think that's one of the things you were just mentioning. All of those guys you mentioned right off the hop, they're all incredibly young. Like it's not just that the team is young, but those are the youngest guys. And so even like, a guy like Alex Formenton, you think to yourself, oh, he's almost a veteran now, right? And he's just because he's in his 5th season. And but he started as young as you can, and that's true of several other Senators players too.
Yeah, and
so they're going to change over time. Is why I bring it up. It's
definitely.
Not like, we've seen Brady's going to be like what he plays like. Stylistically, you could have seen that from his father, let alone from him. But you're going to see improvements and changes because he's still quite young.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of shocking because like when you look at Brady Tkachuk and how he conducts himself, he looks like he seems like he's 26, 27 years old and he's 22. So it's kind of wild. But another guy who had a hell of a season was Josh Norris. I mean, 35 goals, and Ottawa hasn't had a 30 goal score, let alone 2 in 10 years. So Josh Norris, I think last year we saw some of his two-way game. And then this year it was like his offensive game just exploded and he was key on the power play.
Especially, on the power play, as you mentioned, and doing a fair bit to create, but especially finishing. He's probably the first like really marquee finishing talent, even if his true talent isn't what we've seen this past year, even if it's a little bit weaker than that, which I think we kind of all have to be ready for. Even still, he'd be the best pure finisher on the team by some distance. And that's with, even taking Stützle into account. That's something that the Senators really, really need. A lot of teams can get stuck, especially really young teams can get stuck in this trap where the only offense you get is cycle offense that you can't sustain for very long. And then when you do finally get a look, no one's got the ability to really, break out of play to actually score, instead of just to have a nice looking shot where you go, oh, that was nice, what a shame. And so having somebody like Norris with that kind of finish is like it's sort of been like an analytics blind spot, if you like, for years. Where because we all spent so much time, all of us kind of analytics types spent so much time talking, I think fairly enough, about just shot volume. You've got to be able to get over the blue lines a little bit more and get out of your own zone a little bit more. And then the pendulum is sort of swinging back a little bit where now you can say, well, it's nice to be able to create some good looks, but you need some guys who can finish. And Norris providing that is really just what the Senators need. They could do with several more guys who are like real shooting threats the same way that Norris is.
Oh, definitely. And, I think Drake Batherson is one of those guys who, prior to getting injured, and I know, Sens fans listening, screw that Aaron Dell guy, but but he was, over a point per game player. He gets injured and comes back late in the year. He a little slow the first few games back, but still kept his scoring touch. And for a guy who's signed through the next 5 years at just under $5 million, he is providing a lot more value than I think the Senators were expecting going into the season. And I guess what could you say about Batherson's game?
Well, he's more of a Swiss Army knife type. The shooting talent is there. He's got a great shot, but he's also creating more offense. Norris is creating very little. He's primarily just in the right spot to finish it off when it comes through, and which I say is kind of like, it's sort of like saying that a guy only does the most valuable thing. Is not really is not supposed to be damning with faint praise. Whereas Batherson is he's decent defensively. He's contributing quite a bit offensively, both at 5-on-5 and on the power play. And when he's the guy finishing the play at the end, he's scoring quite a bit more often than you'd expect. If he was just an average NHL shooter, and that's the kind of guy. More like we were talking, all the guys we've been talking about before have had this sort of, real unusual quality. Like Brady's unusual like this, and Norris is unusual like that. And Stützle, we'll talk about him later, I'm sure is unusual all in his own ways. Whereas Batherson is much more just like if you took a regular NHLer and then just made them a little bit better at a whole bunch of stuff. And that's the sort of thing where you want to, you want 10 guys like that on your team if you can get it. You can put them anywhere you want in the lineup, give them lots of minutes, hardly any minutes, special teams or not. Like you don't. That's the real problem, is not so much, that individual players aren't particularly good. It's just that instead of having one guy like Drake Batherson, you want 6.
I would be all for cloning Drake Batherson for the Sens.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the same though to say something about like a guy like Josh Norris. Like if you had 6 players like Norris, then even though in some sense Norris is providing more value, I think, than Batherson, but if you had 6 guys like Norris, then they can't possibly all do that. There's right. only one guy gets to shoot the puck in the net at the end of the play, and you need even just on a forward line, you can't have 3 forwards like that. The long, like if you want to cast your mind back to when you've had 3 forwards who were plus finishers, you got to go all the way back for the Senators, all the way back to Alfredsson, Spezza, Healy, and that's that. And those are like unicorn lines, right? You talk about those in fond terms of reference. Even at the time, we all knew that was something special, even then.
Right.
So there's something about like utility players, which is not meant to be an insult in the slightest. But Josh Norris is not a utility player, and Batherson is, and you want as many of those as you can, because whatever it is you ask them to do, primarily, they're going to do a really good job at it. And it's not going to be a huge loss if they're not doing some other thing, because it's not like they're the only person who can do that. Whereas, if Norris gets shunted into a position where he's not going to get serious power play minutes, where he's not going to get, the green light to shoot the puck when he wants to, huge amount of his value just evaporates right off the hop. And so you can't, whereas with Batherson, you can say, well, or a guy like him, say, well, you play here, play there. We're not going to worry if it's not perfect. We just know it's going to be good.
Right. So we touched on it a little bit, but Tim Stützle started the season out pretty slow on the wing. And then Ottawa had some injuries down the middle. Colin White, Shane Pinto both go down. And all of a sudden, Stützle finds himself thrust into the second line center position for the Sens. And in the last 30 games of the season, he was a point per game player and really came alive. So, I mean, aside from being a super electrifying and exciting player to watch, what did your data sets kind of say about his game this season?
Well, the real difference between any given player, we were talking before about how Brady has sort of taken his style and like mollified it a little bit, sort of smoothed off some rough edges. Whereas with Stützle, especially defensively, it's like night and day this year to last year. Last year, he was legitimately terrible in his own zone and was constantly, whether or not you could even see him in the frame, was constantly permitting his opponents to take incredible chances. And this season, it's not at all like that. And in fact, he's quite a bit stronger defensively than most of the other forwards, which is, on the one hand, you pick a guy at second overall, you expect them to be able to pick up the game pretty quickly. But even superstars like Jack Eichel, when you look at their progression, spent several years of being really weak defensively before they found their like NHL caliber defense. And there are some players, like Alex Ovechkin, who can be incredibly good and incredibly valuable for their team without ever acquiring, that kind of defensive ability. And so with Stützle, it's remarkable that he's already been able to find that. And he said it himself, right after he got moved over to center in the interviews, he was saying, I prefer it here. I find it more comfortable, which is not normally what you expect for, 21-year-old players, 18-year-old players, 19-year-old this year, being moved over to center where you're getting more responsibility than you used to have. Like I think that's really unusual, but you can tell that he's not just making that up, because he's better defensively at center with more responsibility than he was defensively at winger with fewer responsibilities. I think that's part of it, is just that you can see that so much of his individual skill comes from what he can personally do with the puck. And as a center, you just have the puck more.
Yeah, definitely. And you can see, like, especially when the Sens are behind, sometimes he'll just take the puck and he'll try to do it himself. Now, obviously, he's not in the same ballpark as Connor McDavid, but like Connor McDavid does when his team needs that goal, he'll just kind of go coast to coast. Nathan McKinnon's the same way. So not again, he's not, at the level of those two guys, but it's exciting when he does that. So,
and we've seen that before, a little bit from Chabot and a little bit from Karlsson, in previous years, where they had that same ability to kind of grab the game by the neck, if you like. But it has a different quality from a defender, where the options sort of, I don't know if run out is the word, but as you move up the ice, even if you can manufacture those kinds of great stick handling rushes, you still have to, I mean, every single play, no matter how good or how bad, you still have to chain it into the next play. You still have to come to what's next. And you get more options when those come off of forward rushes than when they come off of defender rushes.
Definitely. Well, speaking of Thomas Chabot, let's talk about him. Obviously, when you're looking at Ottawa's blue line, he stands out as the one young defenseman who really leads the team and when he's not in the lineup, you can tell that he's not in the lineup. So, what does a guy like Thomas Chabot do for the Sens?
Well, he brings, more than anything else, he plays an incredible number of minutes, which actually makes it a little bit harder to get a really good beat on him. He doesn't look quite as good in standardized analytical techniques as you might expect. And part of that is that if you take the approach that everybody on the ice has to wear the credit or the blame for everything that happens, then when you play on a weak team and you play very, very large minutes, it's going to really be noticeable. The sort of extra weight of the team is going to press on you. And then, of course, he's not a particularly precise shooter of the puck. He shoots quite well, but he doesn't shoot to score very much. And he prefers to, like Karlsson did before him, prefers to shoot for confusion, to shoot for rebounds, to shoot into soft spots, to like more like area passes that happen to involve the goalie than sniping corners. And so the impact there is going to be felt less in his minutes and more, as you were saying, in his non-minutes. When he's missing entirely, then all of a sudden, you see the cracks in the holes. And in a team like Ottawa, which, as you say, they've missed the playoffs for however many years in a row, they still need a ton of improvement. The players we've been talking about the players who don't really need to improve very much. It's the depth of the team which needs to be dramatically overhauled. And you notice that in those situations where Chabot isn't constantly putting out fires for everyone. And part of that, of course, is by giving the coach options. He permits Smith to be able to bury guys who need the help, to move them forward a little bit, to keep them out of the defensive zone. But it also, all of those things, that also limits Chabot a little bit. And so he's not, you're seeing that you're not getting the offensive production, and you're not getting as much of the ability to match to best players that you would like, because you're already up against, presumably, his more or less hard limit of just how much hockey a single player can play.
Yeah, 100%. He's unreal. I think at one point he had a game where he played, it was close to 40 minutes. It was ridiculous. I believe it was last season, but yeah, he just can crunch minutes like that. So it'll be exciting when the Sens potentially have two guys like that when Jake Sanderson arrives on the team. But speaking of players who maybe didn't weren't very whelming, I guess. Was there any player who kind of underwhelmed you when you looked at their data set, who maybe you thought should have done more, or you were expecting more of them?
I was more optimistic than on ice results have borne out, about Erik Brannstrom. I thought when he came over in the Stone trade, I was really excited about that. I thought he was going to be, that guy to take a lot of load off of Chabot, to play a lot of minutes. And I was also excited just as a general direction of the team, because it sounded like they were going to press him into service fairly soon, which I felt would have been a welcome change. And I've been disappointed on both fronts there. The coaching staff has been very slow to include him, slow to address him at all, slow to give him minutes, slow to give him important minutes. But then on the flip side of that, he's also, in the minutes that he's been given, he's been less impactful than I had hoped he was. And I don't, sort of in retrospect, I'm not perfectly sure why I hoped so much for him. But just based, I guess, on what other people said and on the kinds of reviews that he was getting from people I respected. But there hasn't really been that much from Brannstrom that's made me think, I'm confident he's going to be an everyday NHLer, let alone the kind of possible star that it sounded like he might be in the Stone trade.
Yeah, definitely not the best return on that trade, especially when Stone was a heart and soul guy. But keeping in line with Ottawa's blue line, I think an underrated gem who they signed as a free agent out of the KHL was Artem Zub, who really emerged as a reliable defensive defenseman for the Senators. So what's been his analytics like when you've looked at him in your model?
He grades out like a shutdown defender. Hurts the team's offense, but hurts his opponent's offense even more. And so that's a bit one-dimensional in a way. But then, I mean, that's the reality of actually trying to make a roster, is that not every player is going to have every strength. And, it's not like you can, my whole sort of reason for existing is to try to explain first to myself and then to other people, that you can't just rank players on a some sort of slider that goes from bad player to good player. You have guys who are like Alex Formenton, who are generating a lot of offense and also giving a lot of offense to your opponents. And then you have guys like Zub, who are the opposite. And so you have to put them into spots where they're going to be, where you can use their benefits and shelter the harms, and skillfully you can put them together. And so he's been playing a lot with Chabot, and I think that's a natural fit for just stylistically they fit together quite nicely, where you don't expect Zub to be making the kinds of passes, the kinds of risky plays that would generate offense, because you have Chabot for doing that, who's obviously going to handle the puck a lot more. But on the other hand, Zub is especially good. His strengths are especially without the puck. And that fits really nicely with a pairing with Chabot, where that Chabot is going to be more comfortable with the puck. It's just like we were talking earlier about Stützle, where that fits especially, with defense pairs, it's always a little bit trickier to get a hold of, because you don't have that positional sort of guide where schemes are set up to have centers with the puck much more often. But with defenders, because there's only two of them, you can't. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the Guy Boucher days where all of the breakout was done on one side all the time, and it was very, very lopsided. You need to have a little bit of back and forth, but still you would prefer to have something where the roles are a little bit better defined, where each guy knows to play to their strengths. And I think that works with Zub and Chabot specifically. But then Chabot is versatile enough that you can move him around a little bit. You don't have to play him only with an offensive guy like Chabot. But you do have to realize that if you find another shutdown guy and you decide to pair him with Zub, then you've created a very limited pairing, which you can only usefully play in certain minutes, in certain situations, which in itself is not a liability, but I don't think we've seen all of the value that Zub will really give because the Senators just haven't had the kind of depth or weight, I don't know what the word is, just quantity of leads that need to have time taken up. They've been behind and trailing so much. So I think if they improve as a team, as I think we all hope that they will and expect, given their youth and their skill, then you'll see, I think, more from Zub, where his talents will be more useful.
Right. And getting a little sidetracked here, but what do you think a defenseman like Sanderson could help to do for the Sens? Like, do you think he would take the load off, Thomas Chabot, for example, maybe not as a rookie, but is it possible in the near future that he's able to do that?
It's very difficult to project. I'm one of the reasons that I spend so much time working with data generally is that going by eye, especially for players playing in different leagues, is extremely difficult. So, you watch him play, and I've watched him a little, and you see, certainly I've seen what he's done with the Sens, but the bulk of his work is with other teams. And so there it's difficult to say, how easy is that going to translate? He's not playing against lower caliber opponents with lower caliber teammates, et cetera. And so I would be wary of penciling him into a role ahead of time. I try to be a little bit more sort of agnostic that way, where especially with young players, it's easy to say, look, today you're going to play with so-and-so, tomorrow you're going to play with so-and-so. And you can reinforce to a young player, we envision you as a big part of the team. We picked you however high in the draft. We're investing this time into you, but we don't have you written in for a specific role, because you can discover that, like, one of the things that we've discovered is that guys who don't score at the lower levels, like in junior or at college level, they don't transition into NHL defenders at all. And which is a little bit counterintuitive. Like, you'd think that maybe the shutdown defenders at those levels would perhaps graduate to become shutdown defenders in the NHL, but they don't. There's a handful of exceptions. And so if you look at somebody who has this offensive pedigree, it's very easy to say, oh, we're going to slot you in as the heir apparent to our offensive NHL level. But in fact, even the really defensive players in the NHL were generally much more offensively. Just kind of sort of the matching effect to how 80% of the league is officially listed as center, because the forwards in the league are listed as center because they all played center when they were younger, because that's where you put your best guys when you're 14 years old. And that, which is the kind of stock that becomes NHL stock. So I would wait until I had a bit more, not just NHL games, but NHL practices, NHL preseason games too. I would look at a lot of actual results as far as I could from Sanderson before I would say, okay, this is the role we envision for you.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So let's then look at players that are already on the Sens roster, and we'll talk about young players who haven't really defined a role for themselves quite yet, but are still young and maybe are taking strides towards that. Are there any Ottawa Senators who we haven't talked about already who you think are standing out or are showing promise going forward?
I have, I hesitate, like I was saying earlier, to use the word underrated, because it always sort of raises this issue of, who is doing these ratings, which are incorrect or correct or, off in whatever direction. But one player I see maligned a fair bit is Colin White. In particular, the people don't like how old he is, which is bizarre because he's the same age as Chabot. And also people don't like how much he's paid, which is considerably more understandable because he's paid, I think, a little bit more than he's worth.
Yes.
But he provides a lot of defensive value, and most of the sort of more exciting, more marquee names are more offensive players. Even the defenders that we were mentioning, all so far at least have shown more of their offensive abilities than their defensive abilities. And so I would, if I could, in particular, I see chatter every now and again that he should be bought out. I think that would be a drastic move. I think they should play him. I don't know how far into the future the plan has to go there. I don't subscribe to a team building theory that everybody who's ever been good for you has to be kept around. I think you have to be confident to make moves whenever you can improve the team, no matter if that means moving it around. But I would like to see him take on a regular role in the plans of the team going forward. I think he can be still a contributing player, even as all of the 22-year-olds plus Stützle all mature into, peak age players.
That's actually pretty interesting because, for myself personally, I like Colin White as a player on and off the ice. Seems like a funny dude. I actually went out and got his signed, warm up Canadian Forces jersey this year, and I like the guy. My problem is he's making just under $5 million for the next 3 seasons, and because he's under 26 years old, if they bought him out this summer, then they only have $875,000 against their cap for 5 of the next 6 years, I believe. And
that's true.
And with that, next summer they need to extend Zub, they need to extend Tim Stützle, who I assume is going to get a healthy contract if he can maintain how he was playing at the end of the season. And I don't know what their plans are for a guy like Connor Brown. But I know the team also wants to bring in a legitimate impact top 6 forward this offseason. So my only issue is I would love to see him get another chance. But then after this offseason, his buyout cost goes up to 2/3 of his contract value. So it becomes much harder to either, hide that money elsewhere or trade him. So that's my only concern. But I do agree with you that I would love to see him really emerge. I'm just wondering if this is kind of because of the contract situation and the future contract situation of the Sens, if this has been his last season. That's my only thought.
Well, we know, of course, that money dictates a lot of the decisions that go on around the team. There's however many stories told about which players we like best and which players management likes best, which players coaches like best. But the Karlsson trade, the Duchesne trade, the Alfredson trade, the Stone trade, those are all money motivated trades at the end of the day, one way or another. And then of course there's extra confusion about that because the internal budget presumably can't be that different. The finances of the team haven't seriously changed, but the ownership has obviously changed in a way that nobody fully understands yet. The current situation presumably can last for, well, who knows how long. With this slightly awkward setup of the existing management, the board that's been put in place, the daughters who are in principle inherit, but would have to be vetted by the board of governors. The NHL, the league itself, is going to step in presumably at some point, and in fact, presumably they've already told any number of people what kind of outcomes they desire. And there's any amount of confusion about just how much debt is the team under, what will the internal budget be for this coming season, and then of course, as you point out, you can't just make today's off-season decisions about this off-season. You have to be looking further down the track, especially when money becomes an issue like that. And if if Claude Giroux says in discussions with them this summer, if he says, I'd love to come to Ottawa, but not this season, maybe next season, I'm going to sign a one-year deal somewhere else. You can't. If you say, oh well, that's a shame, we would have loved to have you, but I guess now it's not going to work. You have to make some decisions in the short term that keep those kinds of doors open,
right?
For next summer. And if somebody like Colin White is a casualty of that just because he happens to be paid more than he's worth, then that's like the actual part of the game, which is a business, not it's this trope that people repeat constantly, but it has a certain element of truth to it.
Definitely. Well, I wasn't actually expecting to go on an offshoot rant about Colin White's contract situation, but hey, that's where it goes sometimes. But looking at the roster overall and the Sens this season, what were their main pros and cons that they had when it came to 5-on-5 play, the power play, and the penalty kill?
So at a total team level, there was very little that you would say was really good, except the power play.
Okay, that's something.
The power play was, and in fact, the power play I thought was one of the, not the very best, but certainly one of the stronger power plays in the league. Comfortably in the kind of power play that you would, you'd look around the whole league and you would say, that's in the top third of the league, and especially with the combination of the scheme, the players, and the playmaking, and then the finishing, primarily from Norris, as we were talking about earlier. There was not a lot where you'd say, that's like, we have to fix that. But every other area of the team was either a little below average or more seriously below average. And at the root of it, sometimes you can point to teams that have, specific holes and specific players who are playing way above their heads. And for the Senators, the problem is just volume. They just need so many guys. You have, we were talking before about Batherson, about how you need 7 of him. And so maybe you can't actually get 7 guys who are as good as Batherson. That's a very difficult thing to put your hands on. But maybe you could find, 4 guys who are almost as good, and take 4 guys who are slumming it on the third and fourth lines and in the third pairing, and move them for picks, or just move them along one way or another. And part of the difficulty here, and this is where the Senators have this unusual trouble, is that those kinds of players are the ones that wealthy teams just say, thanks for all your work, take your buyout money and go somewhere else. And you can do that as politely as you like, but for financial reasons, that's been on the table so rarely for the Senators. And that occasionally has worked out, where they've been able to take on, to get rid of guys like Ceci when they didn't feel like they could afford the kinds of money that he would be requiring. And so they had that deal with Toronto, which worked out quite well, brought in Connor Brown, among other things. But every other part of the rink needs help. And so that is the kind of thing where I don't think you can pinpoint a specific player or two, or an assistant coach or two, and say, that guy's got to go and be replaced with somebody else. You need a mentality around the whole team that says, if somebody phones us up and offers us a deal where we can get a tiny bit better, we got to do it and get a tiny bit better, and not worry specifically about, that ruins some little wrinkle about roster construction that we were trying to use for this season. You have to be a little bit more flexible than that, I think.
Right.
And say, well, we're going to do this anyway, even though it's not in the plan, because it makes the team better. And then another thing's going to come up, and if that makes the team better and it goes back in the other direction, we're going to do that anyway. Just, as long as we ratchet the team up all the time. If you keep on making those moves all the time, and part of that is related to what we were talking about earlier, about how the strengths, your good players, your core players, the best ones that you don't have any intention of trading. Like if somebody phones you up and says, I want to give you like a second round pick for Christianity, then you say, absolutely, right? You do that deal as fast as possible. Yeah. And if somebody phones you up and says, we're going to give you 2 first round picks for Tim Stützle, you say, go away. It's, even though it's much, and you don't pull out your calculator for rearranging core pieces, but because those core pieces are so young, and that they aren't going to just develop into better versions of what they've already been. They're going to change qualitatively in terms of what they're actually best at and what their weaknesses are, in fact, that you need an approach to roster building that's similarly flexible. It says, we're not going to get hung up on, we've got to have a guy like this on the third line. We've got to have 2 guys that hit like this, or that don't hit like this, or that skate fast or don't. You can't have 2 specific ideas. You can think like that when you're a couple pieces away from being a contender. Then you look for the right pieces of the right shape or the right thing. But you can't think like that when you're in the position in the league that the Senators are at. You need to be a lot more flexible and a lot more willing to change your ideas about the whole roster, not just about individual players.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. All right, let's end on a fun note. So you once tweeted that any NHL team could hire you for $1 million a year, and you would do nothing but say, don't do that 5 times a year, and it'd be worth it. You'd be worth the hire for that money. So are there any signings or trades that Ottawa's made over the last season or 2 that you've thought to yourself, I would have told them not to do that?
Do you know? So people always bring up this tweet. It's probably my most famous, and I'm always a little bit embarrassed because I was so incredibly drunk when I tweeted that. Just to an almost extravagant degree, to a degree that I hardly ever get anymore. It's 5 years, 6 years old now.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't remember the specific thing that made me think about it, but just for a little bit of context, it was not the kinds of problems that the Senators typically have. Every team which makes bad mistakes does so in their own way. And the Senators' mistakes tend to be of the kind of self-constructed, slow-moving sort of steamroller kind of thing. We can't do this, and so we got to do this. But they can't get it for short term, so they have to do it long term. So they have to make these risky bets. They have to try to do something to please fans, and so they bring in Matt Duchene, or they have to try to do this, or they have to do this, and they don't have the money for this, and they can't afford Mark Stone at this price, and so he has to go. And those are not the kinds of mistakes that you can fix by sort of tapping someone politely on the shoulder and saying, don't do that. But you've got to, there you kind of want to say, look, you just have to not run your team like this. You just have to, start over. Whereas where I think the more like the prototype of the kinds of teams that I was thinking about for those instances are teams like the Flyers, who 4 or 5 years ago used to just say, it's been a dispiriting off season. We thought we'd do better than that. So we're going to trade 7 guys for 6 guys. And they would have these massive trades with lots of picks and really and you would look at that and you think, why would you do that? Why would you you could have just gone to bed. And so I could certainly say, I don't know, whatever the last contract offer was from Mark Stone's camp, you could have just said, yeah, sure. Just ponied that up and found the extra money somewhere, but I don't know how feasible that was. If you have creditors barking down your neck for money and you don't have any more to spend on the hockey team, then you don't have any more to spend. It's kind of academic for me to, but again, you don't get to know that sort of stuff, right? You don't know how tight the restrictions that all the various people are operating under are. You don't know what instructions Dorian is under. You don't know the money constraints. You don't know the constraints of every tide. So, I don't think I would have drafted Tyler Boucher at what was it, 7th overall?
10th, but yeah.
10th, pardon me. Yeah, that seemed not like a pretty big reach. But then, of course, and this is part of what makes the tweet funny, is that every time it's so tempting to look at a move that a team makes and say, boy, that was real silly. And all teams, even the good ones, reliably make minor or major mistakes every year. That's part of what makes the sport fun to follow, is sort of the chaos of it.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. And do you want to plug any of your stuff before you head off?
So you can, so first of all, I should say thank you. It's a treat to talk to you all the time. You can find me on Twitter. That's where I hang out almost all the time. The @ineffectivemath, all one word. It's a joke about how I was trained as a mathematician but couldn't get work as a researcher, and so I had to slum it among the hockey-loving nerds and the hockey-loving non-nerds. And also, of course, I make my living from selling subscriptions to my website called HockeyViz.com, which is not just subscriptions. You can go there and find free stuff. And don't worry if you don't want to subscribe today. I'll have your money eventually someday. And so there's about 1,000 people now who subscribe, and that's my bread and butter, which is what lets me. Those subscribers are, they're literally my meat and drink, and that's how I manage to do hockey work all the time. And it's a tremendously fun job, and not just because I get to come on podcasts like this.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you joining us, and I know I reached out to you and you got back to me extremely quickly. I was a little surprised, so thank you so much. And for everybody who's listening or watching this on YouTube, thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. The other 2 hosts ditched me this week. That's okay. They're on vacation, but we'll be back with another episode hopefully soon. And you can find us on Twitter, just like Micah, and ours is @Senstennial. And that's the main spot to find us, and we'll catch you all for another episode soon. So Micah, again, thanks for joining us, and hope you have a great night.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Take care.
Thanks, you too.